I used to just like hate Shakespeare because I thought the language was archaic, and I was like, why is this guy such a big deal? Like, I get it, but like, why still?
I think anybody who's ever sat down with the text was like, this might as well be a different language.
Who hath any cause to mourn but we?
If ancient sorrows be most reverend, give mine the benefit of seniority.
There is a big stigma with Shakespeare just because he uses such big words and words that we don't use.
Like, what does that word mean? Why are they still saying thou? Why can't they just say you?
What is troubling is getting over the language and paying attention to it for what it is. Because like you're angry at it because it's not modern day English. If you just start like paying attention more, get that little voice out of your head like this is boring and awful, and this whole world opens up.
The cool thing about Shakespeare is that he wasn't writing for like these kind of elite. You think of Shakespeare as being something that you stand and pose and you say, but it's not that at all.
He tells stories that are so relatable, that he somehow, through his words, gets to something at the heart of humanity that writers are rarely capable of doing.
You know, Shakespeare touches on these really big human things. He's talking about like loss and like fighting.
Politics and economics and power.
Crazy things like death and war and like fighting for who you are and like fighting for who you love or fighting for yourself. Like everything he does is very active.
I love Shakespeare. At this point in my college career, I really appreciate Shakespeare for what it is.
On a page, it can seem very stuffy and academic, but like once you figure out what they're saying, when you have good actors and when you have like a world that you can sort of step into, it seems less textbooky. I think seeing it come alive really helps Shakespeare.
There's a lot going on in Richard III. It's one of Shakespeare's, I think it's his longest history play.
It concerns King Richard III, who was an actual person who ruled in the late 15th century.
There are 3 plays before this that kind of give you context for it. Henry VI, Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3, and then we hit Richard III, which is kind of the culmination.
It's like a historical tragedy, you know, loosely based on like the actual like War of the Roses and this fight to claim England's throne.
War of the Roses, everyone, the York and Lancasters are fighting over the crown, and Richard's like, screw this, I'm taking the crown. So he basically eliminates everyone who has any claim to the crown, and in doing so, he kind of becomes very paranoid and even cuts off his closest friends.
Talkst thou to me of ifs? Thou protector of this damaged strumpet, thou art a traitor! Off with his head! Now, by St. Paul, I will not see the same. I will not die until I see the same. Take me, see that it is done. The rest that love me, hear and follow me.
As he gets further and further into his plots, he starts to lose control, and ultimately he loses the power. It's not just a history, it also has elements of a tragedy, it's got elements of comedy in it.
It might surprise people how funny it is, and how accessible and how much you root for this guy who is killing people.
In the very first moment of the play, he starts relating to the audience and starting to make them his co-conspirators.
God bless you and put meekness in your breast, love, charity, obedience, and true duty.
Amen. Make me die a good old man. It's the butt end of a mother's blessing. I marvel that her grace did leave it out.
Kind of the original House of Cards.
I'm watching it, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I shouldn't like you at all, Richard. Like I know that you're like the worst, but he's charming. He's like that jerk friend who like you wouldn't bring home to introduce like to your parents, but like you still like hang out with him.
It's interesting because the real Richard wasn't like Richard III, the Shakespeare Richard III. Historically, he wasn't like this at all. Shakespeare had to make it more of a story, so you had to put good and evil. That's what intrigues me about this play. Not just Richard. I mean, there are all sorts of people who will do certain things to get what they want, and we can't judge that. I don't want to judge Richard right away by saying he's a bad person, period. Why? What compelled him to do what he did?
When I was cast, I had an initial meeting with Lank to discuss how I should spend the time before rehearsal started getting into the character of Richard III, and he said focus a lot on the psychological, emotional state, and also he told me initially that the knee brace was a thing that we were going to use.
Richard is deformed, and we decided for our deformity not to have something facially or with the skin. We decided to have a leg brace and also a wrist brace. And so Kit, he has to limp with his brace on his leg, and then his hand is also restricted by the wrist brace.
It's definitely physically taxing. We rehearsed Act 5 and I came away feeling some bruises on my hips.
He's done a really great job. He's never complained about it. He usually just has to have someone help him get into the brace, get it tight enough so that it's actually affecting his movement.
It's definitely influenced the characterization a lot. It really allows you to get into the psychological, emotional state of the character in a new way, because having something so tangible and so physical to base your emotional life on, it was a really good jumping off point.
Even though he's this very charming, charismatic, seemingly confident guy, he has a couple of lines where he talks about his deformity and how that makes people treat him differently, and probably why he holds all of that resentment.
Be your eyes the witness of their evil. Behold how I am bewitched. My arm is like a blasted sapling withered up. And this is Edward's wife, that monstrous witch that with her witchcraft thus have marked me.
I was fascinated with this idea of Richard having this cane, this brace, something that held him together. Seemed like it was a metaphor for the production.
The aesthetic of the show was taken from that idea, based on that idea of a knee brace, the juxtaposition of something soft and crumbling held up by this hard exterior.
So the main part of the set is this huge castle, and it's decaying and falling apart. And then there's scaffolding in the front, so it looks like it's under construction.
You don't know if it's going to fall apart or if they're putting it back together, and you don't really know that about Richard either until the very end of the play.
And there's this one gleam of life rolling through with this big strip of grass.
Cutting through the stage is going to be this strip of grass where all of the murders are taking place.
The patch of grass, I feel like, it is the softness in this very cruel, hard world. They're playing with a lot of hard versus soft and old versus new. The old versus new just makes sense thematically. You know, you're shifting from one reign to the other. So I know that with the general aesthetic of the play, set, costumes, all of it, it's kind of timeless.
The nature of most Shakespeare, and particularly this show, is that it doesn't need to be set in a period because the themes are pretty relevant. So I think we kind of wanted to blend time period just because it wasn't relevant.
We'd done Macbeth last year, and that had been very period, very Scotland, 11th century, so we wanted to stay away from that. And we didn't want to set it in modern times either, so we kind of picked a timeless period.
I think the timeless aspect of it is really, really cool. Like the juxtaposition between our clothes and our hair and the stage and the props. Everything is from a different era.
Costumes are periodless too. They have period elements to them, but they also really support this whole idea of metal, the harder things being Richard and the softer things being other families and factions.
The first time we ever talked about the costumes, our Scott had ideas that we were not in a particular place or time, that he was very, very interested in the look of metal on soft fabric, and that everything needed to be sexy as hell.
Sexy as hell.
Sexy.
It's going to be sexy as hell.
First of all, the costumes, no women are wearing skirts. She took these very strong female characters and gave them pants with elements of, the past Shakespearean wear. So they've got crazy collars and these detailed coats and things like that. I know that the men have these chain things you wear across your shoulders.
We've got a very, very modern silhouette, very contemporary silhouette, but we also have period details like ruffs and cuffs and chemises in the play, which are all period. So it's an even blending of the two.
We're trying to create a world that is unified. And in any production, if an element sticks out, then I think it's taking away from the entire picture, the big picture.
We always have several design meetings where we'll get together and all get on the same page at the same time. I have been talking to Eric Rentschler about there's grass on the set and there are ladders, so I have to know about those things to facilitate shoes and things.
We have to think about, okay, are there characters wearing high heels at all, or are their skirts going to be touching the ground? Because that would affect if we would leave a gap in the walkway on the scaffolding, or how big a gap we could leave.
And then with Steven, the lighting designer, we'll talk about colors and the way the colors of his light will affect the colors of the fabrics.
In the costume design, they're wearing a lot of black, a lot of leather. So I needed to approach the actors and lighting the actors with something close to white. That helps me get that three-dimensionality, so separate them from their background.
All of the collaborators are contributing visual elements, whether it's the director or the costume designer or the lighting designer. Everybody's contributing to this thing that we're creating.
I think that Lank has been approaching Shakespeare in a really cool way, and in the way that's necessary, which is not making it bombastic and Shakespearean, making it human. I think making it timeless also helps just because you don't have that thing distancing you. Keeping it vague, I think, just allows the audience to have a little more like access to the story.
And really the focus then becomes on the language. And that sometimes is difficult for modern audiences to access.
The story itself, I don't think in most Shakespeare's, is not that difficult to understand. Sometimes the language gets in the way, and it gets in the way, I think, because the actor is overemphasizing certain things within the language, that the language becomes the be-all and end-all.
You can get caught up in the text. That's why Lank is like, these aren't outdated words. Like, you're still saying things that are completely relevant and are inside of you.
If the actors mean what they say, they own it, they know what they say, why they say it, I think that clarifies the story. So they've been working on the text since the beginning of the semester.
Every Shakespeare play that I've been in here, and that, I mean, I assume this is the way it is for a lot of Shakespeare productions, is that you start with the text.
The actors, as soon as they got cast, started having text appointments with Christia, talking through the script and just the meaning of the story.
Christia Ward is the reason that I love doing Shakespeare now.
Christia has really helped us find out what words and meanings we're trying to convey to the audience. That way they know what we're saying and we know what we're saying.
Digging into the text with Christia is really about just unpacking it, getting rid of all of these intellectual notions of iambic pentameter and like how to do this, and it's mostly just about like how does the rhythm lend to the story that you're telling.
The thing about Shakespeare is that he writes in, you know, as we all know, iambic pentameter.
In a verse, there are stressed and unstressed syllables, and by taking apart Shakespeare's way of technically working with those stressed and unstressed syllables, it's a way for the actor to access exactly what the intention of a certain line might be. So sometimes you might run into two unstressed syllables next to each other, and that means something different than if he kept regularly the stressed, unstressed pattern that he usually maintains.
Shakespeare just gives you so much acting fodder just in the way that he writes the lines, like just in what words he emphasizes and in what words he chooses to use and the metaphors he has. Like Margaret's curses are like incredible, like bunchbacked toad, bottled spider. The curses are so good, just like insults that you hurl across the stage, that by Act 4, Queen Elizabeth is like, can you teach me how to do that? And Margaret's like, all right, listen.
Forbear to sleep the nights and fast the days. Replace dead happiness with living woe. Think that thy babes were sweeter than they were, and he that slew them fouler than he is. Bettering thy loss makes the bad causer worse. Revolving this will teach thee how to curse.
My words are dull. Oh, quicken them with thine.
Thy woes will make them sharp and pierce like mine.
We started rehearsal processes about 2 or 3 weeks ago.
We had a read-through. I didn't really talk that much in the read-through because I wanted actors to learn about relationships and the story and what was happening in each scene. I wanted them to learn on their feet as we were actually staging the thing.
Usually in a show, we would block the entire show and then go back and work it. This time around, we're blocking and then spending more time during that first blocking rehearsal, focusing on relationships.
We usually start out at the beginning, reading through the scene that we're going to work that night, then talking about it, to making sure that they're clear on the events of that scene, what's important in that scene, what that scene's about.
Discuss the given circumstances, what's happened just prior, what is your objective in the scene, what do you want, what are your relationships to people.
What do you want in this scene? Where are you at? Don't think about the end of the play, but where are you at in this scene at this point? Okay? So just kind of talk about that.
He also had us do a super interesting thing where we whispered everything to each other.
We just like sat in a circle and we had to whisper our lines to each other, but with a lot of conviction. And we had to really listen and communicate to one another, so that way everyone knew what was going on.
Whispering the scene is actually very helpful because it does add a weird kind of urgency, and you do find yourself like leaning in and the stakes get a little bit higher.
And then we'll get on our feet and start to organically find the scene by moving toward people who we have closer relationships with, distancing ourselves from people who we don't trust at a certain point in time.
Lank blocked it based off of where we thought our relationships would place us in the space. So he just kind of like stood back and let people think like, okay, like, would you like walk over to your brother then? Would you choose to protect your mother?
Think of relationships. Don't think about where you're going, just think of relationships. Think of relationships.
So am I standing by my brother? Am I holding the throne? Am I by my husband? Am I alone?
And though those movements that we create on our feet don't necessarily reflect what the blocking ends up being, it helps us get into our bodies how to physically show the audiences explicitly how we're feeling about different characters to make it more clear.
It's those relationships that tell the story, and those relationships can be supported and emphasized through not only the emotional life of the character, but also their physicality. I kept having them search for different physical relationships, emotional relationships, and then I said, okay, well, let's start there and see what happens.
We would just do that over and over and over again until we were just like emotionally raw and exhausted basically. And then he'd push us a step further and then like it would become electric.
You have to be there emotionally or else it just seems like you're like doing a Shakespeare, and that's like the kind of stuff that people make fun of or like people like don't want to see.
As you know, I've said in classes that Shakespeare a lot of times bores me, and it bores me because the actors are afraid or for whatever reason to go there. Whatever there happens to be.
In the case of Devon's character, Margaret, she's lost everyone. Her entire family isn't just dead, they've been murdered. And she's surrounded by people who are involved in those murders.
So if I go in there just kind of chill about the whole thing, or like talking loudly but not really like meaning what I say, it's just gonna come off as false.
I think Lake's doing a really good job with it. He just kept pushing her until she got there.
When your kid was killed and your husband was killed. Whoa! Sorry. And that's why she doesn't take care of herself. That's why she doesn't care how she looks. That's why she doesn't care what she says. Any of that stuff.
So he had me come in screaming and flailing, and he had me like shoving people, even though that's something that, you know, you don't think old Queen Margaret's gonna shove people.
For Edward, our son, that was Prince of Wales, died in his youth by like untimely violence. And long mayst thou live to wail thy children's death, and after many lengthened hours of grief, die neither mother, wife, nor England's queen. Oh, Rivers and Dorset, you were standers by. And so was thou, Lord Hastings, when my son was stabbed with bloody daggers. Oh, God, I pray him that none of you may live his natural age, but by some unlooked accident cut off.
Watching her be brave and go to that place was, one, really amazing to watch. Devon is fantastic. And two, it inspires you and it makes you feel like, okay, that's where everyone in this room has to go, because if you don't go there, then you're not telling the story.
And I think that's a really good way to approach Shakespeare. You can always pull back or shape something, but if you can't get there in the first place, and like if you don't get a little worked up or snot on yourself like I do when I'm screaming, if you can't do that, then it won't be interesting. We want it to be fun.
If you're coming in expecting to see a Shakespeare play where you want to sleep through it, be open to the possibility that it might not be that.
Don't brush off Shakespeare. I know that the language can be daunting at times.
He is a person and a writer who you have to make a jump as a person to try to understand, but at the same time he's writing about such universal elements of humanity and writing in such an accessible way. I invite and welcome you into the theater, and I'm so excited to see you there.
The show's gonna be good. It's gonna be funny, it's gonna be scary, it's gonna be wacky, it's gonna be murdery. I'm excited to do it. I'm excited for high schoolers to see it especially.